Revit supports the export of 2D and 3D data to other CAD systems. The following outputs are supported: DWG, which is AutoCAD format, DXF, Drawing Exchange format, DGN, which is Bentley MicroStation, SAT or ASYS, which is a 3D neutral file format, and finally IFC, which is Industry Foundation classes. When exporting to other CAD systems such as AutoCAD, you can configure how information and graphical data is transferred. For example, a common requirement in AutoCAD is the correct layering conventions. You can map Revit categories and subcategories to AutoCAD layers. Print settings can be saved and recalled for future sessions. Print settings control items such as paper size, for example, whether you want to use CD or E sheet sizes. The orientation of the print could be portrait or landscape. You may want to fit the page to 100% or half size scale, so you can use the zoom or scale options there. Hidden line views control whether vector or raster processing is utilized when printing. Vector processing improves performance, but sometimes we have to use raster processing if we've used things like graphics or rendered or shaded views. The options control whether things like crop boundaries, scope boxes, or reference planes print. First, let's take a look at the Export DWG dialog box. To view this, let's select File, Export, Options, Export Setup DWG DXF. So the modified DWG DXF Export Setup dialog is now open. On the left-hand side, you can see that we can save or recall export setups that we may have configured. This is very useful if you have different standards and requirements for different clients. On the right-hand side, we have a number of different tabs to control various different elements of our DWG or DXF output. The most important one really is the layers, and you can see here that we have our categories and subcategories from Revit down here. And here we have our desired AutoCAD layer and our color. There are other tabs across the top to control other elements. For example, we can take our line patterns in Revit and map those to corresponding line types in AutoCAD. We can do exactly the same thing with hatch patterns, the same with text fonts. We can configure how our colors transfer through. A very important one is solids. The default is to export 3D models out as polyface mesh. However, I think most of us would want ASYS or SAT solids. Another useful tab is units and coordinates. Here you can see the coordinate system base is set to project internal. Ideally, if you've used a shared coordinate system within Revit, you'd want to configure this to shared. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new setup. So here I'm going to click New Export Setup. We'll call this one Training and then select OK. Let's begin by selecting the Layers tab. Now to begin the setup, you'll notice here we can load layers from standards, and I have some default standards set up. So I'm going to keep the American Institute of Architects standard current, and we can now make some modifications or changes to this. So we'll begin by taking a look at structural columns. So here we have our structural columns category. Notice if I click the plus button, I can see the subcategories underneath. And this is going to be the layer name that's used. So you can see here it's S cols. I'm going to change this to S columns. This is the projection pen we're going to be using. So I'm going to configure this to pen number 2. And you'll notice that everything here is under projection. We also need to deal with how elements are cut. Generally, we'll want to thicken the line weight up in AutoCAD. So therefore, we'll need to change the color. So here we'll change the cut layer name to S columns. And then I'll have section afterwards. And we might want to thicken the line weight. So here I'm going to change this to pen number 5. Now, of course, I can go through and start to configure all of our subcategories as well. So we might simply want this to go on a layer called hidden, and we'll have all the hidden detail on the same layer. and that might use pen number 1. Now, this is great if we want to categorize all of our structural columns on the same layer, but sometimes we might want to split out things like steel columns or concrete columns, or perhaps have different layers for each level in the project. So this is where we can configure layer modifiers. To begin, we're going to minimize our model categories, annotation categories, and analytical categories. This allows us to have a smaller list in the dialog box. So under modifiers, you'll notice here we have material for model behavior. Let's expand that. And you can see here we have all of our material for model behavior settings. So concrete, other, precast, and so on. So I'm going to change this. Perhaps we'll just have conc for concrete, and we'll do the same for the cut. And for steel, we'll have the full name, but in capitals. Okay, so now we'll go back and expand model categories, return back to our structural column category. And of course here we can add or edit our layer modifiers. By default, the layer name is just built up out of structural columns, but this is where we can add our modifier. So here I'm going to add material for model behavior, and we'll add that across. I'd like to have a hyphen as a separator in here, and now that's complete. So we can click OK. And of course, I can now proceed through the rest of my categories. This could take some time to configure, but don't forget you can save these setups and utilize them later. Okay, let's now export a DWG file and review our settings. Go ahead and select OK to the dialog box. Click File, then Export, CAD Formats, DWG. Notice in the top left of the DWG Export dialog box, the export setup is Training. We're going to simply export the current view as it is at the minute. We'll click Next. And we'll go ahead and save this. Okay, so once the model's open in AutoCAD, let's go ahead and review our layer settings. So if we zoom up on one of the columns that we created here, let's select the column. And on the home ribbon here, you can see that we have S columns concrete. Let's have a look at one of our steel columns. So here's a steel column. We can select that. And of course, we can now see that this one is being exported to S columns steel. Here we have our plan position of a steel column and also our cut position of a steel column in section. Next, we take a look at the Print Setup dialog box. Select File, and then go to Print and select Print Setup. In the Print Setup dialog box, you can configure your paper size, your paper placement, whether we're centering the plot or perhaps offsetting it, whether we're going to zoom to fit on the page or in fact print it at 100%, the orientation. Here we can select hidden line views. So most of my views are vector, so I'll use vector processing as this will increase performance. And when we are printing raster files, we can configure our raster quality here. So in this case, because I haven't got any of the rendered models in the file, I'll use medium. Now, of course, if I want to print out monochrome, I can do this. I can select black lines only in here. And in the bottom half of the dialog box, I can configure exactly what plots. So most of the time, we're going to want to be hiding things like the crop boundary, reference planes, scope boxes, and so on. Once we've configured this, we can save as, and we can give this a new name. So here, I'm going to call this Training and select OK. When we now configure a print, you'll now notice that we can choose our setup. So currently, it's the last one we've just configured, which is Training. Okay, in this case, let's cancel the dialog box. Our print setups are complete.